Look, today I'm going to be talking about psychedelics worldwide, difficult experiences or bad trips, microdosing and ceremonial use. And this is a presentation based on Global Drug Survey 2017, so that's the data that Global Drug Survey collected about this time last year. So I'll just get started and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for questions. So Global Drug Survey, if you haven't heard of GDS, what we aim to do is make drug use safer regardless of the legal status of these drugs by sharing information with a whole bunch of different people. Global Drug Survey also puts together apps for folks who can have a look and see how different or similar their drug use is to people like them around the world. And also we try and get out in the media and kind of change conversations about drugs by sort of putting forward different ideas about them using the data that we have. And earlier I was part of the coming out panel before, and I think one of the things that researchers can do is sort of use their data, I guess, rather than say use their story, their personal story. You might be using your data to make a point that somebody else might be able to make through a personal story. And I guess it kind of depends on who you are as to which is more persuasive. So that's something the Global Drug Survey tries to do. So we've been growing, we've been going for like 7 years and getting bigger and bigger. And this year we're hoping to hit sort of above 200,000 and we're making our way there at the moment. I'm part of a core research team that includes 3 others, Adam Winstock, Larissa Meyer and Jay Seferis up on the screen there. And we've just got a whole bunch of people that we work with all around the world, other academics that help us and a whole heap of organisations as well. So, we run a survey, but there's a bunch of things that we don't do. Because it's a purposive or convenient sample, that means we just ask a bunch of people if they would like to participate. And that means that, we don't have a sampling framework, we're not a household survey, and that means we can't tell you things like what's the prevalence of ecstasy use in Australia, and questions like that are things that we can't answer. So we're not really able to sort of replace those sorts of much more expensive household surveys that governments fund, and they do cost many millions of dollars. So we have those limitations, but there are things that we can do, and because we can access groups that are often sort of harder to find, that means we have a more efficient approach. We don't cost millions of dollars, and we can sort of, get thousands or tens of thousands of people who do something which might be quite difficult to find otherwise. I mean, one example, some of the work I've been doing on internet and drugs, when we found out about Silk Road, the online drug marketplace, actually presented on Silk Road for the first time at the last EGA. I was reflecting on that recently. So that was 6 years ago, and the good thing about Global Drug Survey is that you can just decide very quickly, we want to have a module on Silk Road, let's do it now. And so that's what we did, and we were able to, in a bunch of different academic articles, publish the first sort of large-scale information about people who are using these new technologies to buy drugs. So this is the sort of thing that we can do. But what I wanted to talk about today is actually the specialist module that we ran on psychedelic use last year, and that covered 5 topics. The first was difficult or negative experiences on psychedelics. The second was microdosing on psychedelics. I know we have Vince in the room who's done a lot of work on that and presenting on it tomorrow. We also asked people about ceremonial use of psychedelics with shamans or healers. And we asked about their lifetime motivations for psychedelic use. And finally, and very much in relation to the coming out panel we did earlier, we asked about disclosure of psychedelic use to family and significant others, what sort of effects that had. So the sample that we had complete that part, and it was a specialist module, so not everybody, not of the 100,000 people didn't do it, but we had just under 2,000 people who were lifetime users of a variety of psychedelic substances. You can see there that mushrooms and LSD were the ones that they'd used the most often, and as well, actually, a quarter of them reported the use of LSD analogues. So this is sort of 1P LSD and a bunch of different ones, LS, LSZ. And the median age of the sample was 27 years, so they ranged from 16 to 74, so we managed to get some of the older psychedelic users in there. 80% of the sample was male, and we had 1% transgender and 19 female. Now, we do attract, even though we've got only 10 languages, and obviously there's many more languages in the world, but we do attract participants from all over the world, and this is just the sort of mapped number of countries from where this sample came from. But when you look at a heat map, which shows you where they mostly came from. Actually, the majority of them came from Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Italy, so in sort of Europe, and a little bit from here in Australia, US and UK. So we asked, have you ever had a difficult, this is people who've used psychedelics ever in their life, have you ever had a difficult or negative experience after the consumption of any psychedelic drug? And over half of the sample said they had done so. So we then asked about their last difficult experience, as defined by them, which was the main psychedelic that they were having that experience with, and that was mainly LSD, magic mushrooms, and the other drugs were much less commonly mentioned. N-Bohm and 2C family were there. Ayahuasca was not really featured. So in terms of what did that look like? What were the symptoms, I guess, that happened during their most recent difficult experience? The most commonly mentioned symptom was getting caught in a loop of negative thoughts. I'm sure we'll be all familiar with that problem. Being confused or disorientated, overwhelming anxiety, panic, thinking the experience would never end, that kind of thing. And interestingly, we also asked people with their difficult experience to reflect on whether it was sort of worry that people would find out, or fear of police or legal repercussions or things like that, and that actually wasn't very prominent. So it was mainly sort of that problem of really not being able to get out of their experience and just not feeling comfortable in it. Most people, over 80%, said that they self-managed that difficult experience, but also just almost half said that they received support from family and friends in order to manage that experience. And, and just in the last panel, we heard about the safe spaces at festivals and that kind of thing. We had a very small percent, less than 3%, saying that they had, received support from venue first aid and that kind of thing. We don't know how many of these difficult experiences occurred in a festival environment, so that's something we could look into later. So just in the last slide there were a very small number that were taken to hospital, reported that they had serious events in terms of health events after this difficult experience. So in terms of whether they gained insight, we just asked, did you find out about the causes of this experience? Only 1 in 8 said that they had no insight. Most, so 55%, said that they did have insight both during and after the experience as to what was happening for them in this difficult experience. And we wanted to know whether people thought it was a bad trip, and it was interesting there because you can see that just 2 in 5 people who'd had this difficult experience said yes, it was a bad trip. Another 2 in 5 said no, it was not a bad trip, and then the rest were undecided. So I was interested in seeing whether people thought it was a bad trip was actually related to the insight that they gained. So I just had a little look at that relationship. And, there was something there which was a significant relationship there, that the people that had insight, that said that they had insight both during and after the experience, were significantly less likely to call that a bad trip. And I guess, I'm reminded of EGA 2011, when the Erowoods were up talking about, bad trips and why, what makes that bad. Difficult experiences are kind of part of this. So being able to gain insight into that may mean someone can move forward and not necessarily see it as a bad thing. So that was the bad trip stuff that we did. In terms of microdosing, we really just wanted to get a really surface idea, and actually this year's GDS, which is happening right now, we've got a little bit more detailed questions on microdosing. So we asked people whether they'd ever microdosed with LSD or psilocybin in the last 12 months and define what we thought that was. And so less than 10% said they'd done so.
So what I want to look at
every now and again and regularly. But we had 1 in 5 saying that they'd actually done it once or twice. So there was definitely some experimentation with microdosing going on in our sample. But amongst those that had done it more than once or twice, we said, well, what's the rationale? Why are you doing this? And most of them said they were microdosing to enhance performance or to cope with stress, with a minority saying they were doing so to treat a medical or psychiatric condition. But those that were doing so to treat a medical or psychiatric condition were more likely to do so to be microdosing on a more regular basis. And in this one, we sort of thought, well, are you considering microdosing as a replacement or complementary to your medical treatment? So we had 29% saying that no, they don't consider it a replacement. A third saying it was a partial replacement. bit more saying it's fully replaced my traditional ways of treating these issues, but others said it was complementary. So that was sort of a mixed bag there. And finally, the efficacy in terms of people's self-rated efficacy. Obviously, this is not a clinical trial and we can't see the actual microdosing efficacy, but there was nobody that said it was a negative experience. There was only less than 1/10 who said they were unsure, and everybody else thought it was mostly positive or totally positive in terms of what they wanted from microdosing. So that was interesting. So I'm keen to hear more from Vince about the science of microdosing tomorrow. So we also asked about ceremonial use of psychedelics, and we had only 6% of our samples say that they had taken a psychedelic under the supervision of a shaman or a traditional healer. So amongst that group, just over a third of them reported having travelled to another country to do this, and this was primarily to South America, to Peru or Colombia. The median number of days of the ceremony itself was 2. There's a range there, 1 to 100. It's a very long ceremony, that person with 100. But and the median days of actually under the influence of a psychedelic was 1. And 30% of them actually paid nothing for the experience, but of those who said they did pay something, the median payment was €220. The range was very high as well. So, that was where we were up to with that one. So we asked why were you doing this? And the most common response was mind expansion, then curiosity, and then for spiritual and religious reasons. And very few people said that they were doing so to deal with problematic substance use or to deal with physical pain. In terms of the guide, the majority of the samples said that this was a traditional shaman that they were going to, but there was also a significant number that said it was a self-taught healer that they were going to. We asked if the guide had asked the person prior to the experience whether they were currently suffering from a mental health disorder or whether they had prescription drugs for any psychiatric condition. And I guess somewhat disturbingly, a third of people said that that was not a question that they were asked in any way, although the majority of the samples said that yes, either for one or for one of those or for both, they were asked about that, and hopefully that was taken into consideration in their care. In terms of the rating, how would they rate their experience? Almost everybody rated their experience as excellent or good, or there were, about 5% of the sample, 1 in 20, who rated it as bad or very bad. And indeed, there were 2 respondents, a low number, but still there were 2 out of 115 that actually reported seeking emergency medical treatment following their shamanic experience. And I had a look at both those 2 people, and one of them rated the experience very bad and one of them rated the experience excellent. So, yeah, it's hard to know there what's going on. So just moving on to lifetime motivations for psychedelic use, we asked people to think back over their use of psychedelics over the lifetime and rate how important these different motivations have been. And similar to asking them about the shamanic use, curiosity, mind expansion, learning more about yourself, developing a deeper understanding of the world we live in. These were popular reasons. And the least popular reasons were things like escaping from your life, dealing with physical pain. Very few people actually spoke about this. Interestingly, 69%, so somewhat in the middle of these different reasons, 69% of the sample rated recreation, fun and party as important. So I think, we've had discussions already at this EGA about this juxtaposition of some people seeing psychedelics purely as medicine and others seeing them as a way to party, and that these things coexist in the community of people that take psychedelics. So finally, we asked people, have you ever spoken about your psychedelic use to a close family member, for example, your parents? And we got about half in half in terms of yes and no. So the first 3 responses were versions of no, and this was 50%, and the next were versions of yes. So out of those who said no, 5% said no, I was afraid of discrimination. That's why I didn't say anything. 33.6% said no, I knew it would upset the family member, so that's why they've kept it a secret. And there was another set that said they didn't really have a close family member that they could talk to. But I thought it was really interesting for those who did say that they had disclosed the psychedelic use. So half of these, if you just look at those last 3, half of these actually said that was a neutral response back to them. And then a third or so said it was a positive response. It was really actually a very few who said, yes, I told them, and it was negative. So that was really interesting, I guess. I mean, you could look at this and say, well, the 33% of the sample that said, oh, I'm scared to do it, so I'm not going to do it, perhaps they know that they're going to get a negative response. But I thought it was really, I guess, encouraging that the people that did say something, most of them received either a neutral or a positive response to that disclosure. So just a summary of what we've done here. I've probably gone way too fast. What we've learned, I guess, from looking at Global Drug Survey 2017, I think there's lots more analysis we can do with all this data as well, is that, the difficult or negative experiences on psychedelics are common, and certainly in this sample, they were around 50% in terms of lifetime difficult experiences. But really, less than half of these were identified by participants as a bad trip, suggesting that they wouldn't necessarily have changed that, even though they experienced it as difficult. And over 90% of the microdosers rated their experience as positive, and I think there's much more we can learn about microdosing and how that works and how positive it can be for people. Mind expansion, curiosity and spirituality were key reasons for people to engage in ceremonial use of psychedelics with shamans and healers. But we did find that 35% of the shamans and healers did not ask about the participants' medication or psychiatric conditions, and so that could be concerning. Motivations for psychedelic use over the lifetime included these insight reasons, but also recreational reasons, and escapism was definitely a less common reason, and this sort of fits with, I think, what we know. And finally, most disclosures of psychedelic use to family or significant others resulted in a neutral or a positive response, but 1/3 did not disclose for fear of a negative response. So I just wanted to thank a few people that make GDS happen, and also note that this particular module last year was sponsored by the Beckley Foundation and David Nutt's Drug Science, so GDS is really grateful to those amazing organisations for supporting this. We have a large network of partners, as I mentioned, and also wanted to thank EGA for supporting us as well. And currently our survey is open. Can't expect you guys to just suddenly whip out your computers and start doing it now, so I'm not going to say you should do that, but definitely over the next few weeks, if you're interested, to check it out, because what we're really trying to do here is gain lots of experiences that are really diverse about drugs and entheogens across the world, and I think I see it as a way of activism, a way of sort of saying, the standard story that's out there in the mainstream is not the only story. Let's find lots of other stories. There are ways that we can represent that in data in the way that you've seen today, as well as in more, one-on-one type stories. Some people aren't comfortable standing up and saying, well, let me tell you about my psychedelic use. So a way that you can contribute anonymously is to participate in these kinds of projects. So I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take lots of questions if you've got them. Thanks.
Got one over here.
I just had a quick question about how you were quantifying the microdoses. Because I suppose there's not really a lot of standardisation that occurs. So in the context of Europe, there's sort of some informal structures that might determine the amount of micrograms on a particular piece of paper or a bottle, for example. There's probably less regulation in a place like Australia.
Absolutely. And so one of the questions we're asking in the survey that's running right now, so that's Global Drug Survey 2018, is how are people measuring their dose? Are they using volumetric measuring? Are they cutting up tabs? Have they got a powder? How are they managing that? Because I think for some people it really is guesswork, and for others perhaps it's a bit better than that. And so that's something we're exploring this year. But last year this data was really us just saying, look, our definition of microdosing, and what we said was, it's taking an extremely low dose of a psychoactive substance. We gave examples, approximately 6 to 25 micrograms of LSD, 0.0 to 1.15 to 0.05 grams of dried magic mushrooms, etc., 2 to 5 milligrams of psilocybin. So I think we got those from somewhere else. But like you say, how are people in Australia supposed to know that that's what they're doing? So we're hoping to get a little bit more information about that this year. And because we will have a large contingent from those diverse countries, like you say, we will be able to have a look at that and see whether people, also, I mean, some people in Australia are getting their supplies from, online stores or darknet. That means that they're getting that kind of thing, or research chemical type stuff. So some people might have access to
I think the level of standardisation is definitely increasing globally speaking, so
yes.
that's a good thing. But if we could get a therapeutic licensed clinical trial,
Absolutely.
You'd see a 99% success rate with microdosing.
Well, that's what it would be fantastic to have that, yes. I think that kind of data would certainly trump anything that we can do with a survey. We can only really ask people for their opinions and their experiences, but, to be able to do some kind of randomised trial would be the best way to sort of know what's going on, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Monica. I'm just over here.
Hi.
Just wondering, in regards to the positive trips, was there any sort of questions as to why they were positive, and if not, is that kind of where we can take the studies next, as to try and pinpoint why the experiences are positive and find the variables that are common?
Yeah, absolutely. So really, this aspect of the survey last year was, did you have this difficult or negative experience? Yes, no, and then everybody that said no. That was, so that's the people that had, one expects, primarily not difficult, primarily positive experiences. There was no further questions asked there. Having said that, we could look crudely at a regression to, the dependent variable being did they or did they not have a difficult experience, looking at, well, the people that did not, what's associated with that. We could look at it that way. But I think, it does require a deeper investigation in terms of looking at, it's not going to be just demographics, it's going to be much more than that. And I think we'd have to think carefully about the kinds of variables you could even measure in a survey that could bring that together, because you'd really have to think about, setting and set and what's leading up to that experience. And those are the sorts of things, rather than just, straight demographic variables and drug use variables that, I think we can do that, actually. So hopefully we can.
Yeah,
Give me a great idea. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have you, in relation to the bad trip question, have you asked whether in the long term, even though it was challenging, therefore a bad trip at some level, whether there was a pearl of wisdom held in that challenging experience?
Look, I think the only question that pertains to that is the question where we asked about insight. So did they gain insight into the causes? And that's not really what you've said, because you could gain insight into the causes and then you could or could not then go on and have that pearl of wisdom later. So no, we haven't asked that specifically. And, I think that kind of question, because this was all set up around asking about the last negative experience or difficult experience people had. I think that question would have to be around the lifetime. So thinking about the difficult, challenging experiences you've ever had, was there one in particular that, stands out for you as something that was life-changing or something? It's that kind of question, I think. Yeah. So absolutely. So, and I think that's something that, there's a lot of evidence that exists, and that's something that people will recall. I think we've probably all got a story about that. So, and I think, what this module sort of showed me was that, there's obviously a lot of nuance in terms of these difficult psychedelic experiences. We certainly can't label them all bad, naturally. If people have insight into what's going on, then, they're more likely to say, well, it was difficult, I'm not calling it bad. So I think that's sort of something for all of us there.
How have rates of use of different psychedelic drugs changed compared to the previous surveys that you've done?
Yeah, look, I didn't put these on the slide, but I know in the UK sample over the last 5 years there's been an increase in reporting of psychedelic use over time. I would give some caveats that sometimes with Global Drug Survey, it depends on whether we've recruited in the same kind of way each year as to how much you can really say from trends over time. Going back to, we're not a prevalence study, so we can't sort of categorically state that. But in terms of the actual prevalence studies, for example, in Australia, we just had our household survey come out recently, and it was interesting because there were no significant increases in last 12-month use of any drug except for cocaine. That was the one that had gone up. Everything else was either flatlining or going down or rising so insignificantly that it didn't matter. So, on that note, we haven't seen on a household survey level LSD use, psilocybin use going up in Australia. But there are limitations to what a household survey can tell us. And, when you actually look at the household survey data, unit level record data, which is what we get access to at NDARC, what you find is that although the household survey maybe reached 50,000 people, they were only 50% of who was actually targeted. So you've got that bias. What will the other 50% would have said, we don't know. And then when you actually look at some of these drugs, like there might only be 200 people out of that 25,000 that say they've used ecstasy in the last 12 months. So you've got this really small group of people that if you start looking at their demographics and trying to work with that small number, you think, well, even though this is millions of dollars going into this household survey and it's supposed to be representative, what can I know from that many? So it's a tricky thing to work through. But I think there's been so much more discussion of psychedelics in mainstream media over the last 5 years, that there's been so much more discussion of it, potential as medicines, potential therapeutically, and also just their use more generally, that, that's changed. Even if the level might not have changed, there's a more open discussion, I think, going on around here. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Monica. I think that's time.
Okay, thanks, everyone.